This is the Self-Aware Leader Podcast. Now your host, Jason Rigby.
Super excited today, guys. I have Scott Friedheim. He wrote a book called The Code of Conduct. It's 32 chapters of noble tenets and moral insights. And today on this episode, guys, I don't want you to merely listen. You're going to hear some captivating stories from Scott. To me, it's an invitation to reflect on our own values, to consider what drives us, and to deliberate on how we navigate the freedoms that we have in the trials of our life. So whether you're an aspiring leader, which is most of you, whether you're in search of direction in your life, or simply intrigued by the rich tapestry of human experience, Code of Conduct, this book, offers the wisdom and the perspective needed to forge your own path. Scott, thanks for being on the Self-Aware Leader Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. Very excited to be here.
Yes, that's awesome. I want to get into, if we don't mind, right off, because for sake of time, I want to make sure we get through your book, and we're going to skip through some of the chapters and highlight some that really meant to me as I was reading this book. I want to start off with chapter 1, Bravery. And I know on September 11, 2001, we all know that day you faced an unimaginable crisis. Can you walk us through your initial reactions when you realized the gravity of the situation, especially if you could, take in the moment that your executive admin, Marna, screamed upon seeing the attack of what was happening?
So it was a beautiful day. I came into the office and I had one of those interior offices. The exterior offices were the ones with the windows. We were in Three World Financial Center, which is the building downtown Manhattan that has a pyramid on the top of it that's attached to the Winter Garden. I'm sure you've seen the pictures from September 11 of all the damage done. Marna, my exec admin, screamed and ran to the window in the office opposite me. I followed her and I looked up. We were facing south, so just to the left, we were attached to the North Tower of the World Trade Center, and we were attached by a bridge. It looked devastating. I ran back into my office and called my brother, who was in Midtown, and said, "They just bombed the North Tower. It's 100 times worse than 93. Mind you, in 93, I was in the subway in front of the one that was affected when there was a detonated bomb. So I had another close call there. But the day was a series of new horrifying developments as the minutes ticked away. It wasn't much after that the second tower was hit by a plane. I was in the office of the chairman. I walked straight to the elevator after I hung up the phone with my brother to leave the building. But after I pressed the button, I realized our chairman and CEO, who was this decision maker, wasn't in the office. He was in Midtown at a meeting. So I grunted audibly an expletive and made my way back into the office because I knew I couldn't leave. I didn't know who the decision maker was going to be. And then we proceeded on 2 occasions to decide not to leave the building. And that's when I thought, frankly, we were making a grave mistake. But as you know, Wall Street's incredibly hierarchical, and the senior person on premise was insisting that staying in the building was the right answer. It was unclear, to his defense, it was unclear that it was safe outside. This could have been a bioterror attack at the same time. And he was in constant communication with the Port Authority. So it was chaotic. It was a time where the vast majority of people who surrounded me on our floor, the way I describe it is they froze. Frankly, they looked like lobotomized sheep. And it's only after the fact that I realized through some of my own studies what happens when people freeze, when they're pushed beyond the limits of what they can process. And the scope of tragedy, with all of the things that you've seen and read about, all of that was true and happening. And each time you'd look out the window to make sure that it wasn't getting worse, you'd see another horrifying thing. So I, in fact, got caught up in the moment, since I was able to talk to our chairman and CEO away from the process in the building and convince him that the right answer was to evacuate everybody, that I stayed in the building through the point in time that the South Tower was collapsing after we'd evacuated everybody. So I didn't think I was going to get out. And the next couple minutes, I was proceeding to sprint down the stairs 5 steps at a time, in the empty stairwell because everyone was already gone, thinking I wasn't going to get out, and thinking that there was a plane lodged in our building and that our building wasn't as structurally sound. So I fully expected that any second it was going to collapse on top of me. So I went through a period of, I don't know if it was 120 seconds or so, where I was pretty sure that I wasn't going to make it out. And frankly, the reason that chapter is called Bravery is because when I think of a couple things about that day, one of them is unquestionably the selflessness of the people who we have in our communities that are willing to put their lives at risk for the rest of us so that we can live in the blanket of comfort and safety by virtue of their selflessness. And then surely that's fire, it's police, it's paramedics and first responders, but there are a lot more in our community than just that. So bravery to me is one of the defining things that was a wake-up call to me, and I think to many people in our nation.
No, and you have a quote in that first chapter of Bravery. You have the selfless brave earn respect through sacrifice. When you think of those that were, there on site and you saw them, the firefighters, the police, they're just selfless service, and you think of bravery. I like that earn respect. Is there something, and you also had to make a decision that was, probably the hardest decision you had to make in your life because it's to deal with human lives. What was that moment like? And then was there fear? I mean, you talked about, people. I was in the Marine Corps, so you can kind of see that same thing happen in war. But what was it like for you? I mean, a lot of people that are brave are still fearful, but it was just the idea in your mind of helping the people. Like, what went through that?
Yeah, and again, to be crystal clear, I don't consider, and I make a distinction. I don't consider anything that I did on that day brave. I think what I did was relatively instinctive. Um, I've been a businessman. I've been a CEO in private equity and in industry, and my choice has been to have a career in the corporate world. Bravery to me is for all of those members of society, like our warfighters, like yourself, who deliberately say, I am going to pursue a life of service and I'm going to help those in my community. I didn't do that. I acted instinctively in the moment, and I don't view that as bravery. Bravery to me is all of those others that have committed their lives. And for those of us who've had the benefit of going through some experiences like this, um, it's a bit of a wake-up call that we owe so much more than we've delivered. And there's a passage in the Bible that speaks to, the talents that you're given and what have you done with the talents. I can tell you that 9/11 and other moments in my life, like a near-death experience when I was on a bicycle and went head into a truck on a highway, I'm just grateful on a personal level that I get another bite at the apple at my near certain moment of death, because my report card wasn't good enough and I haven't delivered on my talents, and I owe so much more. The book, the premise of the book, is trying to be a disciple, if you will, in a way, which I have not done in my life, within the context of today's society. And you hosting your podcast, being someone who's out there giving an opinion is incredibly difficult in this environment. So what I tried to do was to relay moments of time in history that they're collisions with history that people can relate to, just like 9/11. Um, to say, of all the things that matters, how you live your life is the one that may matter the most. If you're near certain death moment, is going to be like mine was.
Yeah. I think that puts a significance on it. One thing I want to ask you about, because not just at this 9/11, you've had to be brave and make decisions, and we'll get into a few of those with the stories of your book. But you've had to make some pretty important decisions in your life as a leader. What type of process do you go through, when you're having to make a decision that may require a little bit of bravery or may require you to kind of step out of the norm? How do you make those decisions?
So I think, particularly in business, the facts usually drive the answer. And in business school, you learn about decision trees. You learn about the concept of expected value, and you probability weight and adjust, and you look for whatever it is that the economic value is that delivers the highest and best value in light of where you sit on the risk continuum. That's a business process. That being said, like you mentioned, there are lots of decisions that add complexity, and bring other factors into the equation, and the environment, sustainability, and the human condition, and the community. There are lots of other things that will be impacted by various decisions that you make. Two companies merging together, invariably, there's going to be overlap, and therefore there are going to be lots of people who have families and they're the breadwinner, who are going to be affected by those decisions. I did it instinctively. And one thing that I'm trying to say is, don't live your life instinctively. Rather, define the aspirational tenets that you would like to define in your life. I've failed at every single one of mine. So, but that doesn't negate the nobility of defining it and aspiring and trying to live by those. Every company has a budget. I've never run into a company that doesn't have a budget. Well, why do they have a budget? They have a budget to try and deliver on an economic performance that they're seeking to achieve. Athletes have goals. There are times by which they want to finish a race. Analogously, if one cares about the life they live and that they lived a way that they could look back without regret, then it probably makes sense to define what those are. So if you're able to do that, I hadn't. I was doing it instinctively, which frankly is some DNA, some what you're taught at home and in school, and some, if you have a religious foundation, what you're exposed to there. But virtually all religions have the golden rule as a primary articulated theme. So I think you have a better chance of being happy with the life you led if you actually define it. But mine was instinctual. Had I had a list in those important decision-making moments, I would have reflected on those and said, am I living up in light of that? And I think it is a powerful and a good thing. And some of the most enlightened leaders and CEOs are those who don't just go by the math, rather they incorporate their own code of conduct, however it is that they define what that might be.
Yeah, I've always wondered about that, especially when it comes to, I'm in business too, but having to make that decision. And for a young leader, when you're looking at, like you said, the math and ROI, paired to our shareholder value, paired to what it looks like, in your code of conduct, like how do you make those moral filters?
Yeah, it's hard, and I think it's going to be easier if you define it. I'll give you a couple examples. And this would not this wouldn't happen in today's corporate world. It's my first week on the job on Wall Street, and I'm working over the weekend. Wall Street is a pressure cooker of an organization, of an industry, and each of the organizations have a brutal pyramid that filters out people along the way. The most being culled out in the first couple of years of your career. I hear a noise on the floor. It's a Saturday. I'm working on. It was actually a convertible. It was a convertible note pitch for Mark IV Industries. I remember exactly what it was. And I hear a noise, so I walk over to the noise, and there's someone yelling from the other side of the floor. So I walk, peek in, and this person is yelling, "Lampshade, lampshade." I had no idea what he was referring to. Well, what he was actually referring to was, he said, "You are a lampshade." And he proceeded to explain what that meant. Now, I'll get close to what it was, but I can't stomach actually repeating what it was. But it was a reference to what the Nazis did to the Jews during World War II. I was so horrified, particularly because I grew up in Brazil and France. And when I lived in Paris, I had met lots of survivors of the Holocaust, members of the French resistance, Americans who had fought in World War II. So I had deep exposure. When I went to bed at night, my nightmare was not the boogeyman getting me. It was the Nazis coming for me. Even though I'm Catholic, that was the nightmare that I had that was recurring. And this boss of mine is referring to me effectively as a Nazi because of my last name. What do you do in that moment? Now, today, it'd be pretty easy. You just walk into the HR department and that person would never get a job again, and rightfully so. But that wasn't the only instance. I had another instance where I was responsible for MBA, so business school recruiting for this Wall Street firm. And I went in, this managing director called me into his office and said, I hear you are supportive of a candidate, Jim, out of Stanford. I say, yeah. They said, but he's black. I said, yeah. He's got a 720 GMAT, 3.9 GPA, and he has an offer in hand from Morgan Stanley. And he just stared at me as if we weren't on the same page. And how could I possibly be supportive of giving an offer to someone who was black? So what do I do in that moment in time? Again, this was in the early 90s. And I had already experienced, I'll do a third one just to give you a feeling, because it's not just about anti-Semitism. It's not just about racism. We'll go misogyny. So we're in an assessment decision-making moment. We had just met with the top candidates from Northwestern and the University of Chicago's business schools. And we're ranking all the candidates. I'm an associate, so there were two of us and there were two managing directors. The four of us were responsible for who got offers to join the Wall Street firm. And these, at the time, were among the most lucrative jobs that MBAs could get. And we had a scoring system of 1 to 5 based on leadership, problem solving, teamwork, the standard stuff. And the one managing director, as we're going around assessing this woman from the University of Chicago, says 3M. Now, the two junior decision makers, myself and the other associate, kept our mouths shut. Because, again, Wall Street was so hierarchical. And if you disagreed with the managing director on anything, it'd be really easy for them to fire you. And that was that. The HR department was in the room. So this is not some office, hidden away that no one knew what was going on. HR was in the room to give you a feeling for what it was like in, at least on Wall Street, but I think more broadly, corporate America. And the manager director said 3M. So the other manager director said, hey, enlighten us. What do you mean by 3M? And he proceeds to say, in reference to the woman. So
Right.
HR said nothing. So in all these three situations, what was I going to do? Oh, I could clearly say, that's objectionable. And then how would that play out? Okay, I thought more likely than not, I'd be fired. And they'd find a way to fire me, that's that. I could go to HR and guess what? There's now a fight between a 15 to 20 year veteran and a first week on the job kid. I lose that battle. And I had seen a young woman who was, I heard about a young woman who was sexually harassed in the worst way. And what happened? The senior vice president stays, she goes. So it was not a safe place. Rather, what I did is I said, you know what? When I get into a position of authority and responsibility, I'm going to do something about it. And throughout my career, I've done something about it. I'm not a supporter of quotas. I'm not a supporter of changing the standards to put people who are not qualified in positions. However, I am a strong supporter of equal opportunity. And throughout my career, I've made sure that I've been a standard setter in terms of leveling the playing field so that everyone has a chance. You were in the military. Does that mean that you didn't, if you didn't go to the Ivy League school, you shouldn't have a shot at the same job? No, you should. And I should throw resources to prep you just as they got prepped. So by their parents, by their tutors. So when I look back on my career, that's one of the things that I really pressed. And part of the reason I pressed because I lived through experiences that I found abhorrent, objectionable, and inconsistent with, frankly, who we are as a nation or are meant to be.
Yeah, and I think that defines us as a nation and separates us is our bravery. And we have stories that we could go back in the past and go through and see. But that's something, as an individual with personal freedoms that this country, those were fought for through bravery. So I think that's really important. I kind of want to go 180 degrees out and go to chapter 5, Scott, which is compassion. And you have a story in there about Lori Dan, I think is her name. Can you share that with our listeners?
Sure. So I was on. I was a student at Northwestern. I was on the soccer team, and the fraternities were on the north side of campus, and the sororities were on the south side of campus. I had just read that there was a woman who was raped on campus, and I found it disgusting and nauseating. And fast forward a week or so, we were hosting a party. I wasn't drinking. We were in season. And I went to get a bite to eat. I don't know what it was, midnight or something like that. South side of campus, there was a Burger King. So when you're a Division I athlete, or I'm sure like you, you're military, you eat a lot. Yeah. So I went down south and I saw a woman who was walking by herself from the north side of campus. Obviously, I thought it was one of the sorority girls who was heading back to their dorms. So I offered her a ride, gave her a ride. That was it. I never spoke to her. There was no flirtation. There was no exchanging of numbers. There was nothing. I wanted her safe. And that's why I gave her a ride. Well, as it turns out, she had a disorder and she was being medicated by conflicting medications from two different doctors that she was seeing, and they didn't know about the other medication, and it can have explosive consequences. One day, it blew, and she walked into she started off the day by picking up a couple of children and saying she was going to bring them to a carnival. These were a couple kids who she used to babysit for, and instead she went and set fire to an elementary school. This is in the north side of Chicago. And she then proceeded to go to an elementary school where there was another child that she babysat for. She walked into the school with two loaded guns and saw one child in the hallway. He ran in the bathroom, shot him, missed, then shot him again, hit him in the chest. He went down. She went in the hallway. There were two other boys. Her gun jammed. She ran into a room where there was a teacher. It was a substitute teacher. She said, put all the kids, line them up against the wall. The teacher refused, initiated a struggle. But Lori Dan prevailed and emptied her guns into the children in the classroom, killing Nicholas Corbin, who was, I want to say, 7 years old, hit 5 other kids, left the school earlier before she had done the school thing. She left. She went to a few houses, and she had a list of people who she wanted to take to the afterlife, and I was on her list. So she left me Capri Sun packets that she baked with lead, and Rice Krispie treats that she baked with lead, and Capri Sun packets where she used a syringe and injected arsenic. I know that because the FBI technicians came to my house after the shooting and sampled them and then gave me the report. But she then ran into, she jumped in her car, was flustered, got in a crash, ran into a house, shot a college student who was trying to settle her down. She ended the day by taking her own life when the SWAT team had surrounded her house. But what did I see? Why is the chapter called Compassion? Mental health is a real thing. Suicide rates among our warfighters and veterans is appalling. This is a woman who had issues, and our system, our society failed her. So it's not just about compassion towards her, but the children who lost their life, lost their potential, the rest who suffered immense injury, who are scarred for life, for all the family members who have a permanent hole in their heart and their soul. Our failure to address that kind of thing has the opportunity to have such a magnified detrimental impact. And for the rest of us who might not be in the nucleus of that moment in time, I think it's really important that we embrace compassion, understand that you don't know what someone's been through, whether it's when you're driving in a car and someone cuts you off, or whether it's someone snaps at you or bumps you with their shoulder in the street. You don't know what they've just gone through. And I think having a lens of compassion as a companion in life is incredibly powerful and is going to help us in society and being a place that is more consistent with the kind of society we all, I think, embrace.
Yeah, you have that. What you just said, you have the quote in the book, and I have it written down. A lens of compassion is a powerful companion in life's journey. Do you feel like as a leader, there's always this, you know what, I always talk about this in my podcast, not using the L word, love. As a leader, when you look at something being compassionate, you always think of weakness. What do you as a leader have learned, especially in your code of conduct, when it comes to leadership and compassion?
Leadership. We'll talk about leadership. I don't particularly like talking about leadership just because it's become so. It's been such a common thing where CEOs come out and say, "Hey, let me tell you the keys to leadership." And frankly, I find it to be dime a dozen. I would have never written a leadership book. I have no. I have so little time or interest in reading notes on leadership. But as it relates to your personal code of conduct or tenets by which you aspire to, and oh, guess what? You're now in a position where you happen to be a leader. And how do you reconcile those things? I think compassion is unquestionably on the list. I'll give you an example. I was working for a Wall Street firm, and we had a certain complement of businesses. There was another Wall Street firm that had businesses that would merge with ours neatly to add more capabilities. I don't want anyone to figure out exactly who it is. So it could be vertical integration, it could be horizontal integration, it could be geographic expansion. But when I had finished all of the materials, going through the analysis of how much we could pay for this business, it was a publicly traded company. Therefore, the CEO of the other company obviously has a fiduciary responsibility to deliver the best for his shareholders. When our CEO met him at his apartment that night, he said, "So, how are you thinking?" Our CEO said, "How are you thinking about, what you want to be doing going forward?" Which was sort of code for, let's try and get into a conversation about merging. And he said, "I'll tell you, my number's 100 million. Premium will be whatever the premium will be. My number's 100 million." Meaning, I know why you're here. You want to buy my company, but to get my company, you have to pay me personally $100 million. So, what was that CEO doing that ignored your question? Well, in the combination of these two companies, there'd be hundreds of people who were fired. Actually, probably thousands. So think of the thousands of families with the children all out of a job overnight. Now, the combination made sense because in the future, you were going to have more jobs created, more value added in the industry, to corporate America, to society. But in the short term, lots of dislocation, pain, anxiety, and there was no concept of bringing compassion, empathy, care. It was a purely self-focused lens. Probably what a lot of people think about Wall Street. But I think what's really important in all leadership decisions is to reflect on the totality of the decision. That one's really obvious. But there are lots of other micro decisions. Companies going to think about creating a volunteerism program. Did you blow it off, or are you supportive of it? There's going to be maybe there's going to be a corporate philanthropy effort, and they give everyone an opportunity to take out of their paycheck $5, whatever it is. They check the box, say, blow it off. Well, knowing that, if a company can use its corporate resources combined with employee money, if employees want to engage, it can have a magnified impact. How do you embrace this stuff? Do you dismiss it? So virtually every day in the workplace, there are decisions that all of us make, all levels of the organization, that relate to how do I want to live my life? So to your point, it's an everyday thing and it's an every level thing.
Yeah, and I think the story you're talking about was in chapter 12 under ethics in your book. And you have a quote in chapter 12 on ethics: never compromise on ethics. When you're looking at that failed acquisition, due to these unethical demands, what do you think most business leaders, when it comes to self-interest at the expense of, like you said, families or employees, how do you balance that with having to make a hard decision? Like, I mean, obviously the acquisition, you can't have everybody not lose their job.
So the reason I said it's interesting, some people have said, wait a second. The conclusion of the story that we just talked about is that several months later, this CEO sold his company and got his $100 million package. So isn't the conclusion compromise on ethics and you'll get $100 million? The reason I said never is I think biting the forbidden apple compromises you for eternity. And it is going to be incredibly difficult once you compromise ethics to be able to draw a line. I have a chapter, and you said don't use the word love, but I have a chapter in there called Love, and it's kind of like marriage. I take my lens of my marriage to every conversation. There are temptations all over the world. There are temptations to retrade deals. There are temptations to have fun with someone outside of your marriage. There are temptations to cheat on your diet, to skip on your workouts. There are just temptations everywhere. If you take a hard line and you build a career where everyone knows that you're someone whose ethics cannot be compromised, I think it puts you in such a wonderful place in your career. And when you look back, you're not going to have regrets about not having gone for it on maybe a couple extra bucks you could have been able to extract somewhere. Rather, you're going to walk around having a reputation where everyone brands you as, I trust that guy. I've left full-time positions like those CEO positions a number of years ago. Now I put deals together between typically a founder of a company and private equity. And most of the deals that I work on are people that I've bumped into along the way in my career who call me up and say, hey, I saw you do deals. I'd love to work with you. Always loved working with you. You always live by the code of doing the right thing or whatever you want to call it. So it will serve you well. But most importantly, in my view, across all dimensions of life, is for those of us who have not had a near certain death experience and we don't know what it's going to be like. I'm trying to say, I was in one of those moments, and yours could be different than mine. But in that moment, the only thing that mattered, it wasn't my family members, it wasn't my friends, it wasn't what I accomplished, accumulated, achieved. It's none of that. The only thing that mattered was how did I live my life? So that was really the reason why I put the 3 years into it, was because I saw something and I wanted to share that.
Yeah, I love that. And I want to step into, because I found this really, really fascinating when you were working with the brands Kenmore, Craftsman, and Die Hard. And chapter 22, you have strategy. What was this strategy involved in leveraging Kenmore's unique position with the manufacturers? And then can you describe the process of, the innovation roadmaps, and then the relationship between Kenmore and its suppliers?
Sure. So one of the things for mostly the people who are in the corporate world in your audience, one thing that I always think about when it comes to strategy is, where do I have leverage? So with Kenmore, it was Kenmore, Craftsman, and Die Hard, but we'll isolate Kenmore. Kenmore is a brand that was owned by Sears Holdings. And we didn't manufacture anything. Rather, we had a whole bunch of other manufacturers that made the Kenmore product. So Samsung, LG, GE, Bosch, Electrolux, all of these other manufacturers, Whirlpool, they made it. So when I became the president of Kenmore, Craftsman, and Die Hard, I looked at our track record, and we had been declining in market share and profitability for 5 consecutive years in a row. And I sat back and I thought, we are being produced by all of these other manufacturers. I asked someone who was the point person with all of these other manufacturers, find out for me what percent of their utilization in their plants is Kenmore. So if you were one of these manufacturers, and say you were the plant manager in Ohio, or say Michigan for Whirlpool, you had this plant, it was running at 85% capacity utilization, and 25% of that was just making Kenmore washing machines, refrigerators, whatever. So when I looked at the data, I said to myself, wow, if I called them up and said, guess what? I'm not going to work with you anymore. How would the boss of that head of manufacturing fare with his boss when plant utilization goes from 85% down to 60? Probably not too well. So I had leverage. So I then thought, how can I use that leverage? So what we did is we had a process of thinking about, how can we use it? And I got the whole team involved, and we all went around the table through a series of lunches where, think of it as like speed dating, innovating. So every lunch for 1 hour, start, stop, no more. I had this wheel of different types of strategies, and we'd go around the table and everyone would give an idea. And from these sessions, we got a whole bunch of ideas. The outcome of that, so it was engaging everyone's ideas, was that we went to all of the manufacturers and said, we're going to end our 7-year agreement working together. So in 120 days, it's over. They all immediately flew into Hoffman Estates, Illinois, with their most senior people to say, what's going on? We've had a 100-year relationship or whatever it was, and we want to do whatever it takes. So what we said was, we had to get your attention. We wanted a better relationship with you than we had before. You are producing all kinds of innovation. So think on one axis, you've got all of the different types of products: dishwashers, top load, dishwashers, front load, washing machines, refrigerators, etc. And then on this axis, you have time. And invariably, they're building new plants to have new innovations in the marketplace, like the dishwasher that is the most quiet on the market. And then they'd go to market and say, hey, this one makes the lowest amount of noise. Bosch is really good at that. Another one would be the refrigerator with the biggest capacity, so you could put the most stuff in it. That was another one. So what we said was, we want you to give us your full innovation roadmap over the next 3 years. All of your secret plans and projects, you got to let us know. They all said, well, that's like the most sensitive information. I can't give it to you. To which we said, well, then we're not going to do business together. So they all participated. They all gave us all the plans. And then we simply picked what were the best products in the marketplace across all of the manufacturers. And we reset the Kenmore product line and created the largest lead. We were number one in Consumer Reports, the largest lead to number two that we've ever had in the 100+ year of Kenmore. So thinking about whatever it is that you have, whether it doesn't matter what kind of company it is, but thinking where's your leverage, and then how can I translate that into creating a much more profitable business? That's what that was about. And in the case of Kenmore, in the span of 6 months, we went from number 3 in market share in major appliances in the United States to number 1.
That's
So
amazing. I loved reading that when I was in the book. When you think of, this was like a huge highlight for me. In the quote says, think through where leverage exists. From there, much of the right strategy will fall into place. One of the things that you said that I thought was brilliant, and I read in the book, was the strategization that you did with your team. And then allowing everyone, like you just said, to speak and voice. Instead of like being alone in a room or in a big desk and you're sitting there in a library and you're coming up with the strategy. How did you include teamwork in your strategy? Can you go into that a little bit more detail?
I think one of the things, and you coming from the military, it's obviously you've already got it in your bones. A team can create so much more than the individual. So someone may be the MVP, but if, take your sport, whatever sport you want, take the best player on that team. Topic of the day would be Caitlin Clark. If you said, we're going to run the Caitlin Clark play where everyone clears out and she runs down the middle of the court and either hits a 3 or tries to dribble and get a layup every time, they wouldn't do well. Sure, she's the best 3-point player ever, but she's an incredible passer. So what distinguishes her, in my view, is the complete game as opposed to one aspect of the game. Analogously, whatever leader there is, the leader is probably going to be the person who distinguished his or herself in their career, and they happen to be at the right place and time. But if their success for the team is going to be a function and product of their ability to discover the universe of talents on the team and how to use them in the right way. In this example, I had just showed up. I didn't know who was going to have the best ideas. So the only thing I did was create the environment so that everyone who was on the team, and I mean everybody, had an opportunity to play the game and provide input. And I forced it with a clock. So when I talk about this innovation wheel, just so you can visualize what it was, because it could apply to anything, you had a series of spokes, if you will. So one would say product category expansion. One would say product category extension. One would say new products. One would say geographic expansion. So one was a product-related group of strategic plays, if you will. One was distribution channels and a series of strategic plays on distribution channels. So I had a universe of things that related to a business generically, and then said, okay, so for example, on new products, when we were doing Craftsman, well, I don't know. How about lawn care products? We don't do that. We've got the mower, but we don't do lawn care products. Okay, maybe we're permissioned to go there as a brand and maybe not. But it would be those sorts of things. But when we went around the table, it was for each strategic play, if you will, in a generic way, each person at lunch had 60 seconds, no more, to go. So as we're going around the table, they're obviously looking at what's the next play so that they can start thinking, because, and if they didn't have anything, they said, listen, I thought about this, I don't have anything, then we move on. So we went around and made it so that we very quickly got to call it 50 people who were in the business, and everyone had a chance. And the other thing that it does is it creates equity. And when you win based on a strategy where everyone was a co-creator in it, then everyone is fired up because everyone is sharing the victory. It's not about the victory for whoever happens to be in a seat that we're going to call the leader. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the whole team. In the world of Wall Street, Goldman Sachs is the most powerful brand. If you leave Goldman Sachs and you're interviewing in, say, the world of retailing or brand products or distribution companies, and you say, oh, I used to work at Goldman Sachs, the first thing that person in this other industry is going to think is, wow, Goldman Sachs, that's great. They're thinking about the winning team. They don't actually disaggregate it and say, well, which group were you in, appreciating that certain groups were less qualified than others? No. Are you the national champion or not? If you are on the national champion team, you're a national champion. So to me, a really important part about a leadership is the understanding and appreciation that the team gets a lot more done than the individual. And within that, what are the ways that you can try to get them to be co-creators in a common and shared goal, which is much greater in purpose than any individual?
I love that. And for the sake of time, we're coming up on the hour. I wanted to end in chapter 31, which is relentlessness. And you have a journey with CDI Corp, successful turnaround with the group. I want to kind of get into that, but I want to do a quote on chapter 31. You said this: be relentless in the pursuit of your destination. Believe in yourself even when the lights go out. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think this belief in yourself and having this code, and I think this is a good way to end this podcast, is if you have a code of conduct and you're being true to yourself, then you have the responsibility to believe in yourself because you're operating in the way that is ethical and through all of these code of conduct. So no matter what's happening externally around you, internally, you have that compass to guide you. So you have the opportunity not to be ruthless, but to be relentless. So can you talk a little bit about chapter 31 on relentlessness?
Sure. You absolutely nailed it. So I'd rather we just end here. I'll talk about it, but you nailed it. If you've got this thing written down that you define for yourself that says relentlessness, and you get knocked on the ground, and you've got that thing, whether it's a post-it on your computer or wherever you have it, you're going to have a much greater likelihood that you're going to say to yourself, I owe it to myself to get up off the canvas. So in my case, I was brought in to be the CEO of CDI Corp, which was a New York Stock Exchange traded company, to be the turnaround guy. It was on a steep decline, and I came up with a plan. And without going into the whole thing, while the board initially said yes, and a CEO reports to the board of directors, but so we bought a company consistent with the plan. But then when it's time to sell a company, they said no. And when they said no, what I realized in that moment in time is the plan wasn't achievable. So I resigned because if you can't do what your platoon leader, your coach is telling you to do, you do not belong on the field. So I took myself out. I waited a year, and because I had a non-compete for a year, but in that year, I was still in financial harm's way because on Wall Street, with the global financial crisis, I was 18 months from having to file for personal bankruptcy, and I was in rebuilding mode. And this was going to be the job that helped me deliver on my personal financial goals for myself and my family. And there I am, unemployed. And frankly, it's one of those things where I just didn't even want to be around town. So we left town, and I'm walking the streets of Paris for 3 months wondering, what am I going to do? But it was 3 months of high anxiety, high pressure. You can't turn off the spend of life, and I had nothing coming in, and I wasn't out of harm's way. But what I decided to do, frankly, more than anything, was almost out of defiance with the board of directors saying, we're not going to sell this company that you have an offer on. I wanted to prove it to myself that I was right. So I went to private equity firms right after my non-compete expired, laid out a thesis, and with their capital, we invested $135 million in this idea and sold it for $925 million 2 years later, 24 months to the day, and made $500 million for investors on the 135. And obviously, it was a wonderful economic outcome for me as well. But had I not had relentlessness as part of my, at the time, in unarticulated code, then I'm not sure exactly where I would have been. Now, there's no guarantee that things are going to work out quite like that, but it was all of those 3-a-day practices. It was the running on the beach with a soccer ball. It was getting chopped down as a forward by the defenders who were twice as big as me and having to get up every time that I think created a bit of a muscle memory that I took into the business world. So whatever someone's own aspirational tenets are that they want to have as a behavioral guide to their North Star, I think it's really important, because if you don't write down what you want to achieve, then you're less likely to achieve it. Analogously, if you don't write down explicitly how you want to operate, then you're probably less likely to behave that way. So I'm thrilled you asked me the question. I'm thrilled you had me on the show. I love what you're doing and the message that you're getting out.
Well, thank you, Scott. I appreciate it. And I'm going to put in the show notes, make sure we have your book in there for code of conduct, so everyone can go through and create that on their own.